Good evening, Chris. I have two really good guests this hour. Did you hear?
I did. I heard. I definitely know who one of them is. Who we promoted on our show, the governor of Minnesota, Tim Walz, and I'm looking forward to that. I have an inkling who the other is.
Yes, the other one is you. We're getting Tim Walz, his first interview, the Democratic vice presidential candidate, of course, his first interview since the election. Really excited to talk to him tonight. Not quite as excited as I am to talk to you about this insanity that we are living through right now, and also your new book, which I find a constructive, realistic, and sober approach to feeling sane in this environment.
Thank you. That's wonderful. I'm going to see you in a few minutes. I'm going to watch the governor of Minnesota.
All right. Thanks, Chris. Appreciate it. See you in a minute. And thanks to you all for joining us this hour. Really happy to have you here. So there is good news and there is bad news today. Which do you want first? Let's do the bad news first. It was only about 6 months ago, feels like a lifetime, but it was only about 6 months ago that Donald Trump announced who he was going to run with for this past election. It was about 6 months ago that we got J.D. Vance announced as Trump's vice presidential running mate. And the choice was a little hard to parse. He was a good talker, like he's articulate in interviews, but it immediately became clear that he's a bad campaigner. He had a way of inadvertently insulting people and kind of ruining their day with his presence. Remember the poor donut shop workers in Georgia? The polling for him was terrible. The polling said he was the most unpopular vice presidential choice in generations. His record as a public official, or even just his record kind of as an adult, was hard to explain. For most of his adult life, he had been basically a protege, realistically more like an intern, for years and years and years, for one very eccentric, very right-wing, German-born tech billionaire. That particular eccentric billionaire had basically adopted J.D. Vance, had set him up in a whole series of jobs, none of which he had very much success at. But then the billionaire decided that the next job he wanted to put J.D. Vance into was the United States Senate. And so he essentially bought a Senate campaign for him. He made the largest single political donation ever made to a U.S. Senate candidate in American history. And he effectively ran his campaign. And that is how J.D. Vance was effectively given the only job he ever had in politics before he then immediately became vice president of the United States. And, you know, at that point, when he was chosen to be Trump's running mate, you could basically not see him for all the red flags around him. You couldn't make him out amid all the red flags. I mean, the billionaire who gave him all of his jobs and installed him in the U.S. Senate, and who then reportedly told Trump to put him on the ticket with him as his vice presidential running mate, that billionaire himself is on the record saying he does not believe in democracy. He does not believe that women should have the right to vote in America. He once spent a small chunk of his huge fortune trying to get people to move onto floating sea colonies made from shipping containers, because that would be a better way to live than living in countries, because countries are so terrible and so is democracy, right? So that's the political project of the guy whose other political project was putting J.D. Vance in at the top of the U.S. government. So red flag. Also, for someone who had never actually done anything as an elected public servant, there was also a big red flag, at least there was for me, about the way J.D. Vance talked about why he wanted to be in politics, why he wanted to be in charge, what he wanted to do with power.
Republicans, conservatives, we're still terrified of wielding power, of actually doing the job that the people sent us here to do. We've got to get comfortable with wielding power.
If you're not recognizing in this moment how crazy things have gotten and how outside the box we need to think, then I think you're ultimately not really serious about taking back the country. And yeah, look, I agree. We are in a late Republican period. If we're going to push back against it, we have to get pretty wild and pretty far out there and go in directions that a lot of conservatives right now are uncomfortable with.
Indeed, I gotta say, among some of my circle, the phrase extra constitutional has come up quite a bit. We do need to take a much more aggressive stance, a much more muscular stance. We're gonna have to, become a little bit more robust in our behavior.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah, we're entering into an extra constitutional way. We're going to need to act in an extra constitutional way. We're going to need to wield power in a way that we've never wielded power before. We're going to have to, what does he say? We're going to have to get pretty wild, pretty far out there, go in directions a lot of conservatives aren't comfortable with right now. When he says we're in a late Republican period, he's not talking about the Republican Party. He's talking about we're in a late period of us as a republic. Like the American constitutional republic is ending because it's time for something new. This is how the guy talks. This is how he was auditioning to be chosen as Trump's vice president.
Almost the thing that you need to do, step one in the process, is to totally replace, like rip out like a tumor, the current American leadership class, and then reinstall some sense of American, political religion.
Rip it out like a tumor. Rip it out like a tumor. He said, whatever it is we've had in this country, rip it out like a tumor. So this is very bad news, right? When J.D. Vance would do podcast interviews and talk about how the government conservatives should see the government and government should seize the endowments of private universities, with conservatives in control, they should find ways to hurt even private companies that don't support the leader. He said we should rip out the current class of Americans like they're a tumor. Right? When he talked about all these things in these very radical right podcasts, he'd get his interlocutors very excited, these guys who he was talking to. And very frequently they'd want to know more. They'd try to get him to talk about where it was that he got all these great ideas.
How do we, aside from elections, how do we rip out this leadership class? So these institutions are corrupted and rotted to the core. This elite ideology is everywhere and in all the things. What other options do we have besides voting them out, which we're seeing is ineffectual?
Yeah, so again, this is like a tough question, but this is maybe the question that confronts us right now, right? So there's this guy, Curtis Yarvin, who's written about some of these things.
There's this guy, Curtis Yarvin, who's written about some of these things. Donald Trump had to get rid of his first-term vice president because his first-term vice president wouldn't help with his effort to overthrow the government and stay in power despite losing an election. And so Trump sicked a violent, angry mob on Capitol Hill, and that angry mob then proceeded to try to hunt down Trump's vice president, screaming that they wanted to kill him, hang Mike Pence. So that didn't go great. He needed a new guy. For the new guy, he picked this rando who had only been in the Senate about 5 minutes, who nobody in the country had really heard of, who had no political skills to speak of, who was deeply unpopular from the first moment he was named, but he was really linked in to an eccentric, very far-right tech billionaire political faction. And the political guru of that political faction, the guy who inspires all of their political goals, is this one guy.
There's this guy, Curtis Yarvin, who's written about some of these things.
Knowing chuckle from the podcast interviewer. Oh, yeah, Curtis Yarvin. This guy, Curtis Yarvin, that's who J.D. Vance cites as the guy who's been doing the big thinking about this stuff. You tell me if that explains what we are living through right now, today, in the news, because here is Curtis Yarvin.
Why has no one ever suggested, let's just get rid of this thing? You have a government in Washington. You're either for it or against it. But what is government? A government is just a corporation which owns the country. Nothing more, nothing less. It so happens that our sovereign corporation is very poorly managed. And there's a very simple way to replace that, which is what we do to all corporations that have failed. We simply delete them. We haven't been able to do that with our government for 200 years. So it's gotten a little bit stale. The other thing about getting rid of your government is you can't just say, well, the limits of the government are the limits of the formal government. You have to say, well, what is the system actually? And it includes a lot of things that are called NGOs, things that are called universities, things that are funded by the state. It's a very, very large system, and it all needs to be destroyed.
NGOs, universities, things that are funded by the state. It's a large system, and it all needs to be destroyed. because we need to, in his words, delete the government, delete the whole system, including nonprofits, including universities, including everything the government funds. We need to destroy all of it. And why would you do that? What would you want to replace it with?
You need a CEO, and a national CEO is what's called a dictator. It's the same thing. There's no difference between a CEO and a dictator. If Americans want to change their government, they're going to have to get over the dictator phobia.
Americans are going to have to get over their dictator phobia. We need to delete the government, destroy all nonprofits and schools, and get rid of everything the government funds. We need to bring it all down to zero. We need to destroy the whole system. And the reason we need to do that is so we can have a national CEO take over and run everything. And what is a national CEO? A national CEO is a dictator. Just run that definition one more time.
You need a CEO, and a national CEO is what's called a dictator. It's the same thing. There's no difference between a CEO and a dictator. If Americans want to change their government, they're going to have to get over the dictator phobia.
Americans need to get over their dictator phobia. This is the philosopher, right, of this milieu from which we got J.D. Vance. This is the philosophy that drives the eccentric right-wing tech billionaire class that has ascended, that is effectively the defining feature and driving force of Trump's second term. That is where they got J.D. Vance from. Quote, Vance is friends with Curtis Yarvin, whom he openly cites as a political influence. And this isn't like a Rosetta Stone, you know, it's not that complex. But they really did tell us in advance what they were going to do, and now they are doing it. And I think the biggest barrier to getting Americans to understand that during the election campaign was because it was so crazy you couldn't believe they were really going to do it, right? But now they're doing it. Because in order to delete the government, to destroy the whole American government and the American system and rip it out like a tumor, so instead we can get over our dictator phobia and at last have a national CEO. We can at last have a dictator. What do we have to do to get there? What's the operational day one plan to get there? What should we see these guys try to do if in fact they get that power that J.D. Vance says they need to wield more ruthlessly?
So I've reduced this very complicated problem to a simple four-letter acronym, which is RAGE. And RAGE stands for Retire All Government Employees. Very, very, very simple. Now, the problem with this is, why have you never heard this before?
Retire all government employees. It's interesting. He doesn't say fire them. He says retire them, both because RAGE is a better acronym than phage. But he also is suggesting giving them all payouts, giving government employees generous payments so they will all leave the government, so the government can be closed, can be deleted, can be collapsed, so that we can have a national CEO, so we can have a dictator instead. It's a pretty out there idea, right? Pretty wild, pretty far out there, as J.D. Vance might say. But here's what it looks like tonight in the flesh, because they're actually trying to do it. Tonight, a buyout program for every worker in the U.S. federal government. Quote, if you choose to remain in your current position, we cannot give you full assurance regarding the certainty of your position or agency, but should your position be eliminated, you will be treated with dignity. If you choose not to continue in your current role in the federal workforce, we thank you for your service to your country, and you will be provided with a dignified, fair departure from the federal government. This program begins effective January 28th, meaning today, and is available to all federal employees until February 6th, next Thursday. Quote, if you resign under this program, you will retain all pay and benefits regardless of your daily workload until September 30th, 2025, or earlier if you choose to accelerate your resignation. So they're doing it. They're offering a buyout. They're threatening to, well, they are trying to induce every single employee of the government to resign, and they say they will pay them to go. After that, though, no guarantees. Don't you want to get out now? This is weird, right? This is new. The reason this has never been done before is because this is not something that anyone would do if they actually wanted the U.S. government to continue. Even if they wanted to change what the U.S. government did, they would want to keep federal employees in position so that the government could do anything. The idea of retiring all government employees, every employee of the federal government, this is an idea that comes from one weird place. It comes from the very weird, eccentric, right-wing tech billionaire world, where in their eyes, this is the end of the American Republic, and thank God, because this lousy democracy thing has been holding us back, and what we really need is a CEO, a national CEO. What is it they call it again?
You need a CEO, and a national CEO is what's called a dictator. It's the same thing. There's no difference between a CEO and a dictator. If Americans want to change their government, they're going to have to get over the dictator phobia.
What other options do we have besides voting them out, which we're seeing is ineffectual?
Yeah, so again, this is like a tough question, but this is maybe the question that confronts us right now, right? So there's this guy, Curtis Yarvin, who's written about some of these things.
So we're not going to do the voting thing anymore. That has proven ineffectual. But there's this guy that has these other ideas. So now they're doing it. Retire all government employees. On the same day they rolled that out, today they also caused chaos across all 50 states of this country by just announcing that they were stopping all the things the government does, all the things the government funds. And I mean, you could see it. The effects of this ripple out across the country. Columbus, Ohio, Columbus Dispatch. Millions in funding at risk as Columbus nonprofits scramble to deal with Trump pause. The Oregon Capitol Chronicle. Oregon officials scrambling to respond to Trump order freezing many federal funds. In Alaska, the Anchorage Daily News. Catastrophic for a state like ours. Alaska governments and nonprofits react to federal grant funding freeze. Florida, the Miami Herald. Confusion in Miami over federal grant freeze. Channel 10 in Miami-Dade County. Miami-Dade officials very concerned about federal funding freeze. Idaho grant recipients scrambling for clarity after federal freeze. Nebraska officials assessing impact of very concerning Trump funding freeze order. Illinois shut out of Medicaid as Trump enacts temporary freeze on federal funds. Trump order puts $700 million in grants on pause for Louisiana schools. Maine housing authorities can't access funds after Trump's federal grants freeze. So the bad news is bad, right? This is them dismantling the government. And it's not because they think there's a nice, smaller government in there somewhere that they're trying to find. This is them dismantling and trying to get rid of the American system of government. That's the bad news. The good news is they're not all that good at this. And we saw that today in the inexplicable, unlawyered, clumsy language of this two-page order to stop all federal funding. That order directed, for example, that the Green New Deal funding must stop. The Green New Deal is a years-old piece of proposed legislation that never actually passed. The inexplicability, the sort of bumper sticker style language of the Stop All the Funding order is why so many of the initial headlines about the impact of this today focused on the confusion, the lack of clarity, nobody really having any idea what exactly the Trump administration was shutting down. And that was true in blue states, that was true in purple states, that was true in red states. As members of Congress and governors and former government officials and members of the press started putting it together, started circulating lists of all the things that this Trump order was shutting down, the White House themselves appeared to be fairly bewildered by the news that this was, in fact, the stuff that they were shutting down. Like, really, we're shutting down veterans' homeless shelters? We are? We're shutting down meat and poultry inspections? We are? We're shutting down school breakfasts, school lunches? We're shutting down home heating assistance. It's January 28th. We're shutting down housing assistance, including rent vouchers, which is how people pay their rent first of the month when the rent is due is Saturday. We're shutting down food stamps, the SNAP program. Millions and millions and millions of Trump voting Americans get SNAP. Millions of Americans of all stripes. The WIC program, that's food specifically for pregnant and postpartum women and their infants. Childcare, Head Start, suicide hotlines, child abuse investigations, supporting law enforcement, rape crisis centers. Medicaid, which is health insurance for millions of Americans, including especially disabled people, old people, and oh, by the way, it covers 40% of all births in America. And this isn't stuff that they were like proposing to not reauthorize or like asking Congress to cut. They said that money was cut off as of today. And after the Trump White House started to realize that those were all the things they had just shut down, there was a hue and cry and a huge pushback all over the country. And what happened? The Trump White House backed down and tried to say that, oh, this wasn't what they'd meant to do, that no, Medicaid wasn't being shut off. Where'd you hear that? Yeah, tell that to the states that all day couldn't access any Medicaid payments. Again, after a hue and cry and huge pushback, they changed their mind, or rather changed their explanation and said, oh, no, we didn't mean that. Pell Grants and federally supported student loans, those won't be included. Well, they certainly appeared to be on the list this morning. But then after the hue and cry and the pushback, they tried to say, oh, no, they never were. The White House apparently had no idea what was going to turn off when they flipped that switch today. Shut down the government. By the way, what's the government? Ready, fire, aim. This White House had no idea what the impact was of what they were doing. And so they spent all day taking more and more and more of it back as people told them what they had just done and pushed back hard. Later in the day, they put out a new directive insisting, oh, no, we didn't mean food stamps. SNAP isn't being stopped. Oh, we didn't mean that. Oh, and neither are funds for small businesses and funds for farmers and Pell Grants and Head Start and rental assistance, quote, and other similar programs. Anything that sounds good that people might get mad about, we didn't mean that. We just meant government, which sucks, right? We didn't mean all the stuff that people use and like and need. The bad news is they are trying to delete the government. They are trying to get rid of all federal employees. Just throwing a brick through the window on everything the government does. Their aims appear to be as bad or worse than anybody predicted or imagined, even after they picked J.D. Vance. That's the bad news. But the good news is that they're bad at what they're doing, and that there is loud and outraged pushback, and it is pushing them back. The pushback is happening all across the country, red states and blue states. We are about to see the impact of that in Washington. Democrats in the House today called an in-person emergency all-hands-on-deck in Washington meeting tomorrow to plan a response that they say includes not just legislation and communication, but also litigation. That emergency all-hands-on-deck meeting today called by Hakeem Jeffries, the Democratic leader in the House. Today, a lawsuit brought by Democracy Forward has blocked the funding freeze already. It is blocked at least until next week. You know the group Indivisible? They've been doing big, impressive organizing meetings all over the country this week. Look at these pictures of their numbers that are turning out at their meetings right now. These organizing meetings, again, all over the country. Indivisible is calling on Democratic senators in response to what Trump has just done, telling them what Trump has just done here in this last couple of days is so extreme. This is so bad. Democratic senators need to not wait to see what else he's going to do. They actually need to take relatively extreme action in response right now. Indivisible is calling on Democratic senators to, quote, oppose all nominees until Trump reverses the freeze, to deny unanimous consent in order to slow down Senate proceedings, to vote no on all cloture votes, to, quote, force quorum calls at every opportunity. They say, quote, Trump is daring anyone to stop him as he seizes power, ignoring Congress and rewriting laws by decree. They say, quote, we need Democrats to use every procedural maneuver to grind things to a stop and use every media tool to raise alarm and allow public pressure to build. Quote, shut down the Senate. Shut down the Senate, refuse to allow them to steamroll, and take this fight to every town hall, courtroom, and news outlet, quote, shut it down. Indivisible tells us tonight that they've had their members calling the Senate, calling Democrats in the Senate all day, making that demand. They told us they are finding senators and their staffers to be very receptive to this message. It is against the law for Trump to have stopped this funding that Congress allocated. He thinks that that law doesn't count and it doesn't matter. So he did it anyway. For that matter, it's also illegal for Trump to have fired people at the National Labor Relations Board and the EEOC today. It is illegal for Trump to have fired the inspectors general from all those agencies the way that he did. All of those things are actually contrary to law. But in this administration, what are they trying to do? Delete the government and install a national CEO, aka dictator. So him acting in ways that are contrary to law, they see that as a feature, not a bug, right? They want to demonstrate that he does not have to follow the law. Because after all, we are deleting the US government and replacing it with something else. Right? That is what they are offering. They think we're going to get over our dictator phobia and go along with it. Turns out we're not going along with it. Not in the courts, not in the Congress, not in the Senate, not in the states, not in the press, and ultimately, I think not in the streets. Nope, turns out not having it. And it does turn out that their intentions are as bad as we could have imagined, or maybe worse. But now, what did you see today? You saw them cave and mumble and try to take it back and say they didn't mean it. We've got a free press, a free people, and an organized political opposition that represents fully half the country. So here we go. It's on. It's on. It's on.